just for everyone out there, just like know that VBAC is an option for you if you want it. And it's a well supported option for if that's something that you want to do. So if you want a VBAC, just prepare for that and work for it.
Hey, I'm Amanda, mom, doula, childbirth educator, and birth nerd. Welcome to Let's Talk Birth, the podcast where we get into real birth stories, talk through the awkward stuff, and cover the things nobody told you about. So grab your raspberry leaf tea, get comfy, and let's talk birth. Hey guys, welcome back to Let's Talk Birth. My name is Amanda and I am your host. Today I'm super excited to have a special guest on the podcast. Her name is Hannah Gill. She is a VBAC certified doula, childbirth educator, and the founder of Ebb and Flow Birth Co. She is incredibly passionate about supporting parents and professionals through vaginal births after cesareans. Hannah, welcome to the podcast. I would love for you to start out by telling us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into this work.
Yeah, so my name is Hannah Gill, and I live with my husband and 2 children in South Central Indiana. Third baby's currently on the way. And I got into birth work really just after my own birth experiences, which is that's why many people get into birth work. My plan prior to having children was to go to medical school to be a forensic pathologist, and that completely changed. So my background is in the health and medical sciences, and I had a really traumatic unplanned C-section with my first, and after that became a childbirth educator because I just felt like my childbirth education class completely failed me for even like attempting to prepare for a C-section, especially an unplanned one. So I became a childbirth educator first and then became a doula after my experience with my doula for my VBAC. So that's how I got into birth work. And now I focus solely on VBAC and cesarean education and preparation.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is a VBAC exactly.
Yeah, so a VBAC, VBAC stands for vaginal birth after cesarean. So that would be having a vaginal birth after a previous cesarean birth. That could be 1, that could be 2, that could be 3. But in general, the acronym is vaginal birth after cesarean. So
cool. And can you explain the difference between a VBAC and a TOLAC?
yeah, so in the medical field, medical terms, you'll primarily hear TOLAC. So that's going to be a trial of labor after cesarean. And that is basically like before the baby is actually born vaginally. So they're saying you're a TOLAC, you're attempting a VBAC, where most birth workers don't use that term. It's not like a very widely accepted term especially for a lot of C-section moms who already feel like their body failed them and they don't want to feel like their body is on trial and being tested. So generally I just use the term VBAC whether or not the baby has been born yet or not.
Okay, cool. So with that, what would make someone a good candidate for a VBAC?
Yeah, so this is a loaded question, and it's going to depend not only like what country you're in, but what state you're in, what doctor you're talking to at the time. If you're talking to an OB or a midwife, if you're in the hospital or a home, all those things. But in general, I'll just go by like ACOG standards because the majority of people who have a VBAC and give birth are going to be in the hospital or like a birth center with midwives. But in general, it's you've had a C-section, and the incision for that C-section is going to be a low transverse incision, so a low horizontal incision on the uterus. ACOG supports one C-section, but also in most cases will support a VBAC after 2 C-sections. Again, that's ACOG recommendations. Some providers support VBAC after 3+ C-sections. And then you don't have any like major medical complications. Like obviously if you have placental issues, you're not going to be a VBAC candidate. Sometimes carrying twins, you would not be a VBAC candidate. But again, ACOG standards are going to be a lot more stringent and strict. And then they also say that you have to be birthing at a hospital that has 24/7 anesthesia support in the event of an emergency. Those are like the basic overviews. It's just like 1 to 2 primary low transverse C-sections and no other major like medical complications. So
interesting. Let's back it up really quick and talk about cesareans specifically. Mm-hmm. What does a typical planned cesarean look like?
Yeah, so a typical planned cesarean, it depends on the reason for why it's planned. So obviously if it's planned for like something like breech presentation, it can be done a little bit later in pregnancy. If it's a planned cesarean for like placenta previa or something like that, it's going to be a lot earlier potentially. But in general, a planned C-section is going to look like likely a few weeks before the due date, because they don't want to, I guess, depending on the reason, they don't want to risk you going into labor, depending on why you're having it. But it's going to look like, okay, you have your date scheduled and you go in. And generally for a planned C-section, they're going to be like a spinal block versus an epidural, depending on the situation. Generally, it's a spinal block. Generally, you're awake. And it's going to be just a very routine surgery for your birth. And barring no complications, it takes probably 20 to 30 minutes to do. And if it's not an emergency, obviously it's going to be a low transverse incision. There are some exceptions to that. Below transverse incision, usually it's going to be 1 to 2 support people in the OR. Sometimes there's like doulas and birth photographers allowed in the OR, especially in a planned C-section where it's not like an emergent situation. That is more likely. And then a short amount of time in recovery room where you may or may not be with your baby, depending on the circumstances. And then after that, you're just moved to the postpartum floor, just like any other birth would be. So
then what would the risks and benefits be, the main risks and benefits be between a VBAC and a repeat C-section?
Yeah, so the primary risk that everyone talks about, that it's always brought up in VBAC, is going to be uterine rupture. And this is a risk because there's a scar on the uterus. There's a risk for this as well if you've had other uterine surgeries, not just C-sections. But C-section's obviously the most common one. So uterine rupture is a risk, and that is where the uterine scar, where from the C-section, splits open either completely or partially, either before, during, or after the birth process. Most likely it's going to be during the birth process, but that's the primary risk with VBAC. With one prior C-section, it's about 0.5 to 1% with one prior C-section, a low transverse incision, and spontaneous unaugmented labor. So that means no Pitocin induction or no Pitocin augmentation. Pitocin and other induction drugs like Cytotec increase uterine rupture risk. And it's only a slight increase. It's not much. Like Cytotec is not used anymore for VBACs because it drastically increases uterine rupture risk. That was one of the main drugs used like in the 90s for induction of labor, especially for VBACs, and there were a lot more ruptures. But Pitocin does increase that risk. So that's the primary risk for VBAC. The primary risk for repeat C-sections, and each repeat C-section that is had, is going to be like the general risks of surgery, which are, there's a lot, but just the general risk of surgery. And then you're more likely to have like hemorrhage issues after a C-section because it's surgery, more likely to have infections with a C-section. And then the big ones are placental issues, which are like placenta previa, placenta accreta, and the accreta spectrum, and the placental abruption increase with every repeat C-section that is had. And that the other one would be like a hysterectomy risk. Obviously, anytime you're cutting into the uterus, there's going to be a risk of having a hysterectomy. But again, that's a lower risk than like the placental issues that come along with each repeat C-section. So those are the main like risks to weigh between the two. The way this is often presented by providers is they always talk about the risk of uterine rupture and VBAC, but they rarely really cover the risks of multiple repeat C-sections. And a lot of people that I've talked to, a lot of clients, a lot of students have this belief that a repeat C-section completely eliminates the risk of uterine rupture, which it does not. Having a scar on the uterus puts you at a risk of rupture in general, whether you're having a VBAC or a repeat C-section, you have a scar on your uterus. So when you're pregnant, you could have a rupture. But it does increase that risk by laboring. So the risk for a repeat C-section without labor is about 0.16%. So again, really low, but still there. And then the benefits, there's obviously benefits to both depending on your situation. So the benefits of a VBAC, like you're avoiding a major surgery. That would be a benefit for, I think, the majority of people. avoiding a major surgery, avoiding potential risk if you want to have a large family. So if you want to have a lot of children, generally a VBAC is going to be the best bet. So you don't have all those repeat C-section risks. But I have spoken to women who have had 8 C-sections because they were never given the option to like VBAC. They had no idea it was even a thing for them. And then obviously like the hormonal cascade that comes with vaginal birth, even just like people who just want to experience a vaginal birth, or they had a really traumatic C-section and they wanted to avoid that. So there's a lot of different benefits and why someone may choose to have a VBAC. For C-section, there's clearly going to be reasons where C-sections are absolutely needed, like placenta previa, or other major complications where they are needed planned or unplanned. But a lot of the benefits or reasons people would choose a repeat C-section, one of the biggest is like my first birth was so traumatic. I want to like have control over the situation and like avoid that. They want to be able to schedule it, which is the same reason a lot of people schedule inductions. But again, I put a caveat on that because there's always potential that you can go into labor before or your C-section date gets moved or whatever. And then another benefit would be it's a really good option for anyone who has trauma or assault history. A lot of people, I've spoken to people on various sides. So the majority of people would like, if they have a history of sexual trauma or sexual assault, they would usually go the C-section route. But I've spoken to some survivors who have said like their C-section was more triggering for them than a vaginal birth would have been. So it's really dependent on the person. But that could be another potential benefit of doing a repeat C-section over a VBAC.
You mentioned different placental issues that can arise in a cesarean. Can you define each of those?
Yeah, so the first is placenta previa. It's one of the most common that increases with each repeat C-section. But even if you haven't had a C-section, you can have placenta previa. But anyway, that's where the placenta partially or fully covering the cervix. So like the cervix is down here, your placenta is usually like attached up at the top of your cervix, but it's really low. And it's either partially covering the cervix or completely covering the cervix. And that obviously gives like an increased risk of, well, first of all, if it's completely covering the cervix, baby can't come through. Like the placenta is going to be there. And that's
no exit door. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really dangerous. And it could potentially detach from the uterus. A low lying placenta where it's like maybe not covering it, but it's like really, really close to the cervix can cause like potential bleeding issues, and potential abruption as well. So that's like the first one that needs to be watched for. And really the only sign of that, other than like having an ultrasound to see that it's where it is, would be bleeding. Vaginal bleeding is a big one with that. Then you get into the accreta spectrum. So again, it's a spectrum on the way the placenta attaches to the uterus. So in accreta, there's going to be, I think that's the first one. Accreta is going to be where it's attached to the uterus, but like your placenta is starting to embed into the uterus. And then percreta is like your placenta is attaching even deeper into the uterus. And then increta is like it's fully embedded into the uterus. And generally, like in the more severe cases, like a hysterectomy would be needed. Basically, the placenta cannot detach from the uterus because it's embedded. Oftentimes, this cannot be always found on ultrasound with like the technology we have now. So it's possible you could have it and not even know until birth. But again, that's a rare circumstance. And if you have placenta previa, you're more likely to have accreta. So if you have one, like if you have previa, you're more likely to have accreta versus if you don't have previa, you're less likely to have accreta. The other one would obviously be like a placental abruption, which is where the placenta detaches from the uterus prematurely. So like the baby's lacking that oxygen, and it can cause some hemorrhage issues. And then hysterectomy, removing the uterus. So
You mentioned that Pitocin and Cytotec were not good for VBACs. What other parts of labor typically can you not do in a VBAC versus a non-VBAC labor?
yeah, so like for one thing, like ACOG supports low and slow Pitocin for VBAC induction. So there's many VBACs that are induced, but again, it does slightly increase that risk. So anyone who wants to be induced for a VBAC just needs to understand that, especially like if the provider is not going low and slow and they're just like ramping up and maxing out on Pitocin, that obviously will increase your risk because the uterus just gets overworked and really tired. The other things that like you kind of want to avoid, I mean, you kind of want to avoid this in a general vaginal birth too, but like instrumental delivery can increase that chance of uterine rupture. So like vacuums or forceps. So that can also increase the risk. Again, it can be done, but like if you don't have to do it, like you don't want to increase that risk. Epidurals can still be used. A lot of providers will actually like recommend getting an epidural with a VBAC, but it's not required even if they recommend it. Many just recommend it just in case there's a uterine rupture in emergency, so people don't have to be put under general anesthesia. But I have known of cases where even with an epidural, they have to be put under general anesthesia because sometimes the epidural takes 5 to 15 minutes to increase to a surgical dose. And sometimes in severe uterine rupture cases, you don't have that time. Optimal time to get baby out is like for best case scenario, getting the baby out less than 18 minutes for a severe uterine rupture is like optimal. The next would be like a 30-minute time period. So epidurals aren't required, but they could definitely be used for VBAC, but they don't have to be. And other than that, there's really nothing throughout the labor process that like would not be okay for a VBAC, because there's women who VBAC at home, VBAC at birth centers, VBAC in the hospital. So in general, everything else is pretty a go for a VBAC for, as the same as a vaginal birth would be.
Would that be the same with pregnancy in general for a VBAC candidate?
Yeah. So a lot of people like, and the thing that's really frustrating is that every provider like is not consistent. So like ACOG has recommendations, but not all providers follow them. You'll get different answers between providers, which is very, very just annoying. Even within the same practice, providers can treat you differently. The biggest like recommendation as far as like pregnancy is to at least wait 6 months postpartum to get pregnant again. That allows your scar and incision to fully heal, like as much as it can, to reduce that risk of rupture. There are people that I've talked to that have had Irish twins basically with VBACs. But again, it does increase that risk to get pregnant before the 6-month time frame. ACOG basically just has the same recommendation for everyone across the board, but no one listens to like the 18 months before like your next baby. I mean, that's a general recommendation for all birth and pregnancy, no matter what type of birth you've had. And the general consensus is like 6 months, at least wait 6 months. But some providers will tell you 18 months birth to birth. Others will tell you 18 months birth to conception. So there's not consistency in that.
Love it. So how can parents advocate for a VBAC in a hospital system or with a provider that might push back?
Yeah, so the biggest thing, like if you have the ability to switch providers, do so. If you don't have the ability to switch providers, which I know many people are in the circumstance where they cannot switch for whatever reason, then just be prepared to advocate for yourself. The biggest thing is not going to be like knowing all the stats and like data and stuff like that. Like, I mean, you can know that, that's helpful. But the biggest thing is just knowing your options for birth, knowing that ACOG supports it, first of all. Like, if your provider, if like the hospital doesn't have a VBAC ban, and the provider is still saying they don't support VBAC, that's just for their own like legality reasons, and it's just like not following their certifying body's recommendations. But it's still like the biggest thing is like no matter if the provider is supportive or not, it's still the person's choice to birth vaginally. They don't have to consent to a surgery if they don't want it. So just knowing their options for their birth, not just for like I want a VBAC versus C-section, but like, do I want an epidural? Do I not? Do I want to be induced? Do I not? Because some providers, they'll support VBAC, but they will not induce VBAC. Like that's just a policy they have. They will not induce because it does increase that chance of rupture, and they're just not comfortable with that. So it's either spontaneous labor or repeat C-section, which is really unfortunate. but like there's a difference between, okay, you can decline an induction, but you can't like force a provider to induce you. And that's like extra, extra stuff that they don't have to do. But basically, just like knowing your options and knowing the language to use. Like some people say, oh, just say no. No is a complete sentence. Yes, it is. I agree with that. But it's, if you want to feel more confident and you have to know like the words to say, especially for those people that are like really deter from like confrontation and they're like people pleasers, like I was there, that was me. So just knowing like something as simple as, I understand your recommendation. At this time, I am declining XYZ. I'll let you know if I change my mind. Please put that in my chart that I'm declining. That really gets people going. Like if you say, put that in my chart, like they're more likely to like listen to that. So just like knowing the language to say, but not only the, like you yourself knowing how to advocate, but all of your support people need to know how as well. So whether that be your partner, your husband, your doula, your aunt, your uncle, your mom, whatever, everyone who's going to be in your birth space or supporting you throughout pregnancy should know how to advocate for that. They should know about VBAC. They should know the pros and cons, the risks and benefits, what you're wanting, because there could be a potential time where they have to speak up for you and you're not able to. So it's not just about self-advocacy, it's about like your whole team being able to advocate too.
Amazing. What red flags should someone watch out for when they're interviewing providers about VBACs?
I love these. Okay. So I always tell people when they're interviewing providers, please ask open-ended questions. Do not ask yes or no questions, because if you just say, do you support VBAC? They're just gonna be like, yes or no. So if you ask open-ended questions like, how do you feel about supporting a VBAC patient? Or what was your last experience like supporting VBAC? Then that makes the provider really talk. You'll be able to tell their tone. You'll be able to tell like their real feelings about it versus just like yes or no. So the first thing is like, no matter what you're asking about, no matter what you're talking about, ask open-ended questions. And if you don't feel comfortable with their answer, have them elaborate. Like say, like, can you explain that further? And then like the biggest red flags are like, you have to be induced by a certain date, or you can try for a VBAC, is a big one that you hear, like, oh, well, we can try. And then like, oh, well, we require an epidural, or like anytime they have like all these like extra policies and extra like circumstances that they require for a VBAC, that's just like, no, that's not it. That's not it. That's not a good thing. The other one is like, when they bring up your reasoning for your previous C-section, which I mean, that could be relevant, but they're like, oh, well, it says in like you might have a really small pelvis, or your baby was really big, like blah, blah, blah. Or there are some providers that just clearly pull the dead baby card and they're like, you can rupture and you and your baby will die. I'm like, that's a little drastic. Like, yes, ruptures happen. Yes, they can be catastrophic. Yes, like things can happen, but that's just not the great, like, don't just pull that out to start. Like, you can also die during a C-section. So let's just not like bring out the death card, please. That's like a big red flag. Generally, like the more questions you ask, the more like clearly you'll understand. But one thing I always like to bring up too is like, even if your provider seems supportive, it's always possible that towards the end they're going to change their mind. They're going to have some reason to like double back and be like, wait, well, I don't know if we can do this now. So you could feel like you have the most supportive provider ever, but then towards the end, when things are really getting down to the wire, they could like change their mind and do a bait and switch. So I always have people like ask about things ahead of time, like induction, like what are reasons you would want to induce me for XYZ? Or how do you feel about going to 42 weeks? Like preparing, or like, what if I start showing signs of preeclampsia? Or what if I have gestational diabetes? Or what if I'm GBS positive? So all these things that come up during the end of pregnancy that they're like, whoa, like, I don't know if we can do this anymore. Ask those questions too. Or like, what if my baby is measuring large? Like, do you still feel comfortable with this? All those like red flags at the end that like give a provider an excuse to like start intervening. Ask questions about those too.
Have you seen a difference in VBAC support between OBs, midwives, and the hospital system versus a home birth or birth center system?
In general, yes. It depends on the state, but like I'm in Indiana and legally you cannot VBAC in a freestanding birth center. You just can't. It's like legally not allowed. It's against some Indiana state policy or something. So you can either VBAC in a hospital or you can VBAC at home, which make that make sense, please.
Yeah.
That you can't VBAC in a birth center, but you can VBAC at home. Um, so yes, in general, you do see a big difference. Like the majority of the time, OBs are going to be either like not super supportive or just more skeptical or like more prone to like intervening. Um, but then I've seen a lot of, in my area at least, there are several home birth midwives who also are extra cautious. Like when I was doing research for my second baby, my first VBAC, some of the home birth midwives would not take a primary VBAC. So like the first VBAC after a C-section, especially like if you had not had a vaginal birth before, they just like logistically and legally were not comfortable doing that. And then there's some obviously home birth midwives who will support like home births after 5 C-sections. So it's really going to depend on each individual provider, but in general, more home birth midwives and birth centers where it's legal will be supportive of VBAC. But I, like my OB, and I know many OBs in our area who are supportive of VBAC. It's hard to find, especially in certain states like for example, South Florida, like Miami, they have like an 80% C-section rate at some hospitals, and it's just absolutely insane. Finding VBAC support there is like a lot harder than a lot of other states. So, but in general, I think we're seeing an increase in OBs and hospitals supporting VBAC. Like the overall VBAC rate has gone up about 2%, like 13 to 15%, which is good. So we are seeing that increase there. But in general, it's more supported, more openly supported in like the home birth community. But like I said, the majority of people that are going to be back are going to be in a hospital. They're not going to be at home.
Okay, cool. So with hospitals then, what are some policies that they typically have, like continuous monitoring or induction protocols that really impact VBAC plans?
So the big ones are like epidural is required or recommended. Again, that can be declined. Induction, either they say induction by like 39 to 40 weeks, or they have a policy that's like there's no induction for VBAC. So that's like a big one. Either it's spontaneous labor or a C-section. Another one is continuous monitoring. That is a big one for VBAC because one of the first signs of uterine rupture is like a decreased heart rate for baby that does not recover. In addition to like pain between contractions that does not go away, and then vaginal bleeding and other things. But one of the first things is fetal heart rate deceleration that does not come back up. So continuous monitoring is a big one. And then other places like that usually allow laboring in the water or in the shower, a lot of places do not allow that for VBAC. And then another one I would say is you cannot have C-section, or can't be back after a certain number of C-sections. What are some other ones? Oh, some places it depends. Again, like I said, there's not consistency. Don't allow VBACs with like multiples, so like twins or something like that. So those are the biggest ones that would have the most impact, I believe. Yeah, the continuous monitoring is a big one. And then like the induction policies, depending on where they are.
The water policy, that's really interesting. Why would they be against that?
So the main thing is some hospitals still don't have like waterproof monitors or like monitors that are like easy to have in the water. But another one is like in the case of a uterine rupture and emergency, like being able to get like the mom could be like unresponsive or something like that. So be able to get them out of the water safely is like a concern, to like be able to do what they need to do in the case of a rupture or an emergency. So it's like just the logistics of like getting them out of the water, like especially if mom is not coherent, or like, I don't know, they're wet and slippery. I don't know. Just like logistically getting them out of the water.
Can you talk a little bit about the emotional challenges that VBAC hopefuls face?
Yeah, the biggest one is belief in the body's ability to birth vaginally. Um, that is absolutely the biggest one. Like, but the weird thing is like that's the biggest mental challenge. But because of that, people generally focus on preparing their body or changing their body, but not working on their mind. So they believe that their body failed them, their body didn't know what to do, so they do all these things physically, which are beneficial as well, like chiropractor, pelvic floor PT, exercise, acupuncture, massage, all those things, certain nutrition, but like all those things are very, very helpful. But when it's their mental state that's believing that, they really need to focus on that mentally. So that's the biggest one. Other ones are like the fear of uterine rupture. That's a huge one for a lot of people. Some people like they're so terrified of that happening that it's almost like they either choose repeat C-section or like they just get in their heads about it so much. So that's another big one is uterine rupture, which especially in the online space, I feel like, and with providers too, I feel like uterine rupture is either downplayed way too much as like it's so low of a risk that you shouldn't even have concern over it, or it's like so exaggerated. Like if you have a rupture, like if you VBAC, you will rupture and you and your baby will die. Like that is a guarantee. And it needs to like not be exaggerated or under exaggerated. It needs to, there's some nuance there. Like, yes, it is a low risk, but it's still a risk that does happen. Someone has to be that statistic. It's got to be someone. Someone fills that quota. And it can be catastrophic. There can be lives lost. So it's not like it's something that should not be considered when choosing where you want to give birth, who you want to give birth with, when are you going to get pregnant again. But it shouldn't be like downplayed so much where it's like not even considered a concern. And it should not be like over exaggerated where it like scares people from attempting VBAC at all. And again, that depends on like the personal situations too and all those things. But another big one is just like people having trouble believing in themselves and supporting themselves because no one around them supports them. So if they don't have a support provider, and then maybe their friends and family, maybe their partners are not supportive either because they're scared, or they're just uneducated on the situation. So just a lack of support really like has people struggling mentally. So they don't even believe in themselves because no one around them believes in them. And it's just like this vicious cycle of just like negative beliefs about their ability to birth. So those are the biggest ones. And then I guess another big one too, because some people, I would say a good portion of people who have unplanned C-sections have some sort of birth trauma surrounding that. Not all C-sections are traumatic. Some people have great C-sections, but still choose to VBAC. And just working through that trauma and being worried that like where their birth went bad the first time, it's going to happen again. Like, especially if there's very specific scenarios. So for me, like before my C-section, I pushed for 4 hours with an asynclitic baby. So for me, pushing with the VBAC was like my main concern. I was like, I know pushing is going to be mentally the hardest for me to like work through. So I knew like ahead of time I need to prepare for that mentally, like that pushing stage. So especially if there's like a very specific traumatic or like noticeable event from their first birth that they need to work through to like prepare for the next one.
Okay, so then what would you say to the case where, say a mom, first baby ended in a C-section, second baby was attempted VBAC, ended in a C-section, and the third one they really want a VBAC? How would you coach them through that mentally?
Yeah, the first one is going to be, if possible, finding a provider that supports VBAC after 2 C-sections, because a provider, just not everything, but having a support provider just eliminates like half the battle. So finding a supportive provider. And then I always have clients like very in detail, like process their birth experiences. I have them get their operative reports, their hospital notes, all of those things, read through them. and figure out what happened, why it happened, how they felt when it happened, all of those things. But it kind of like helps them detach from the emotion of it to like see just because usually medical notes are really just dry, like there's no emotion in them. So being able to like detach from that, like yes, you have still have an emotional lived experience, but seeing just like the data, the numbers, what happened medically, can really help them understand. But so for a VBAC after 2 C-sections, first, like they still have to, do they still have a desire to be back, first of all? Because some people just at that point may not, after so many C-sections, 2, 3, whatever, they may just be like, you know what, C-sections are for like me from now on, depending on their reasons for the C-sections. But if they still have a like a deep core desire to VBAC, just remembering that why, and depending on why their first or second or whatever C-sections happened, like encouraging them, having them and being empowered enough to make different decisions if potential decisions that were made during their births potentially resolved in that. Not saying that like you know for sure that this decision caused something, but once they like process their birth experience, they'll know like, oh, I'm going to do this differently next time. So for me, a big one was like I had planned to go unmedicated my first birth, but I didn't actually do anything to prepare for that. I was like, oh yeah, I'm not getting an epidural. I'm just going to go in there and have a baby. I got an epidural right away. I had a horrible experience with the epidural. So I knew like for my VBAC, like I'm going unmedicated and it's like I'm preparing for that. And then like just so like knowing just like what decisions they would make differently or what decisions they would make the same, because at the end of the day, like it's still their decision and they still have to like be confident and own their decisions. Even if they choose to do everything exactly the same, because that's the thing that's so hard. It's like I've known people that have done literally everything in their power to like prepare and like do everything they could for a VBAC, and it still ended up in a repeat C-section. Or they did absolutely nothing at all. They just grew their baby, went to birth their baby, and had a VBAC. And sometimes it's just like, you don't know why, it just happens. So just really empowering them to own their decisions and to make a birth plan. This is a big one. Make a birth plan for both a VBAC and a repeat C-section, because for so many people mentally, it's like just the thought of even having another C-section is just like such a negative thing to them, that coping with that, if it does happen again, it can make it a lot easier to cope through that if you like know ahead of time, okay, in the case of a planned C-section, this is what I want to happen. In the case of an emergency or an unplanned C-section, I would still try to like these, like preparing for it ahead of time. It's not like manifesting that it's going to happen, but mentally, you know, like the possibility is there, which can bring people a lot more peace if it does happen in the end.
Oh yeah. That's exactly what I tell my home birth and birth center clients, is to do that exact thing. Have the birth plan or the birth preferences list for their home birth, like their ideal birth, but then also in case of hospital transfer or in case of induction, to
Right.
also have that thought through, because you don't want to make those decisions so last
In the
minute in the heat
moment.
of the
Yeah.
moment. And yeah, it's too much at that point.
Yeah.
So with that, actually, what are some things that you would suggest VBAC moms should include on their birth plan?
Yeah. So, some people get like super, super detailed. Some people get like they're very, just like general, like couple bullet points. But the big things are like, your monitoring preferences. So like, do you want continuous? Do you want wireless? Do you want intermittent? Like those things. Big ones are like epidural or no epidural, cervical checks. Like, do you want cervical checks? Do you not want cervical checks? Pushing positions is huge. For a lot of VBAC moms, they're concerned about the position of their baby because maybe their baby positioning was the reason for their C-section. So pushing positions is a big one. Being able to be upright, push in upright positions, labor in upright positions. Another big one is like in the case of an emergency or whatever, this is what you want to be done, for like the repeat C-section plan. And I'm trying to think of other ones that I included. So I talked, like, I did hypnobabies for mine, so I included like all those things on there as well. Um, but if they if they have a doula, to include all of that on there as well. Especially if they want the doula with them in the C-section room if it happens. That needs to be like clearly outlined as well. And then induction preferences. So like if they do need or want to be induced, like if possible, they prefer like a membrane sweep first. If that doesn't do it, then like a Foley. And if that doesn't do it, then okay, induce Pitocin. So just like all, like anything you would include in like a regular birth plan. But it's specifically like if there are things that impact the VBAC experience that you want specifically, or if there was like a point of like trauma from your other birth that you want to be avoided, things like that. But yeah, just mainly like the big things that you would include in a normal birth plan.
So, how would someone in preparation for their VBAC, how would they prepare their body and their mind for to increase their chances of a successful VBAC?
Yeah, so the first one, like mentally, is you have to believe in yourself before anyone else can even believe in you. Like if you're sitting there saying like my body failed me the first time, it's gonna fail me the second time, like that belief in yourself is like the core of it all. And knowing like what length do you want to go to, like what preparation do you really want to do, because some people are like, I'm not doing anything. I'm just gonna eat healthy, hydrate, grow my baby, birth my baby. Other people want to do all the things in their power, check all the boxes, because they want to know that they did everything they possibly could. That was me. I'm like a very type A, like I'm doing everything. So I know like at the end of the day, if I have another C-section, it's really needed and something I chose, and it's not something that was like forced upon me or I was coerced into. So mentally, it's just like processing your previous birth, processing your trauma. Not saying you have to be completely healed and you can't be like mad about it still. I still get mad about it, but just like processing it and just knowing like what happened. You're not going to always know why it happened or like what the outcome would have been. Like don't live in that like, well, maybe this would have happened or this could have happened. You don't know any of that. Just like process your birth, process your trauma, especially if you know something's going to come up in your next birth. And then mentally, like, be prepared and ready for, like, obviously from your first birth experience, like, things can go wrong. Shit can hit the fan. Sorry, I don't know if I'm supposed to cuss. But just like knowing, it's like for me, it was like, okay, my plan A is I'm going to be unmedicated. Okay, but I know that there are potentials where that would need to change. So in plan B, what is that going to look like for me? And plan C, what is that going to look like for me? Just knowing all of your options, how to pivot, like mentally, that like gives you so much more control, like mental control over the situation. And like nothing's going to blindside you. Nothing's going to like shock you. You're going to be like, oh, well, I need to be induced now. I never thought this would happen. Like at least prepare for the potential that it would happen. So that's like mentally, like, because a lot of people say that like you have no control if you have a VBAC, but you have more control over a C-section. You have so much control over VBAC. You have control over every single decision you make. So that was another big thing for me was with fears and like mindset was like making a columns list, like a 1 column, 2 columns, like here's everything I do actually have control over. I have control over whether I choose to get an epidural. I have control over whether I choose to push upright or push on my back or whatever. Like what do I actually have control over? What do I literally don't have any control over? I have no control over, like really no control over the position my baby chooses to be in. Like you can do all the things, spinning babies, ECV, whatever, but sometimes your baby is just going to choose to be in a position and you don't always have control over that. You have no control over whether your uterus ruptures, whether you have a uterine rupture. Yes, you can make decisions that increase that risk, but you have no control over whether it actually happens. So like making lists on like what you actually do have control over, focusing on that, and then releasing, like fear releasing the ones you don't have control over. So mentally, those are some like really good things to do. physically, depending on the reason for C-section, like the most beneficial things physically for a VBAC would be pelvic floor PT. I recommend that over anything else, other than like walking, nutrition, hydration, like all the normal birth stuff. Pelvic floor PT is a big one, because some people assume that like their pelvic floor is weak, but it could actually be overly tight and strained, and your Kegels or whatever the heck you're doing could be making everything much worse. So pelvic floor PT, pelvic floor lengthening exercises can not just help with like releasing tension in the pelvic floor, but could help with like the pushing stage, postpartum recovery, keeping baby in like an optimal position. So pelvic floor PT is the number one thing I always recommend. Chiropractor is another big one that many people do, just to have like that spinal and hip alignment. Acupuncture is another big one, not just for like labor induction. A lot of people do that for labor induction, but for pregnancy pains, like I went to got acupuncture for my sciatica, and that was like wonderful. Spinning babies, again, like if you have the baby that was in a wonky position the first time, like maybe do some spinning babies, or like body ready method is another great one. And then like scar. So a lot of people worry about their scar during pregnancy, but postpartum after C-section, doing that like scar release work, scar mobility, scar massage. You can do that during pregnancy too. So that's another big one. If you have like pain in your scar during pregnancy, and so many people worry like if their scar hurts during pregnancy, that's like a sign they're going to rupture, and it's not. So doing that like scar release can be really helpful. But I know a lot of people have like triggers surrounding like looking at their scar, touching their scar. So that could be another big one. But the biggest things are just gonna be like pelvic floor PT, acupuncture, chiropractor. And then like everyone's always like, we all see it, not just for VBAC, but like, how do I go into labor? Like, how do I induce labor? What do I do? So like obviously people can eat the dates, drink the red raspberry leaf tea to strengthen their uterus. But when anyone asks me that, I'm just like, if possible, have sex with semen present, because that's going to work way better than dates. And then like deep squats to get the pelvis opened. Just all of this like normal end of the pregnancy exercises or whatever to do. One of the biggest reasons, like at the end of pregnancy, when everyone's just like huge and uncomfortable and exhausted, and they're just like freaking over it. I always remind people, like, remember why you wanted this in the first place. What you're feeling right now, this discomfort, this pain, this exhaustion is temporary. Remember why you wanted this VBAC to begin with. That really helps them stay motivated at the end, because I know so many people have just been so over at the end, and like rightfully so. Like, and the end of pregnancy is freaking hard, especially if you have other complications and you just feel like crap. They're just like, you know what, just schedule my repeat C-section. I'm not even doing it. So just like reminding them of their why, like why they wanted this in the first place, why they worked so hard to get here, to really just keep them motivated and confident at the end.
What you mentioned a few minutes ago of laboring upright. Are there specific comfort measures, positions, techniques you recommend specifically for VBACs?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, if you feel most comfortable being on your back, okay, do that. Like, be in the position that's going to feel most comfortable for you. But laboring upright as long as you can, like as long as possible. Even with an epidural, you can still be upright. So, depending on like what position your baby's in and stuff, you might have to do different things. But laboring in a squat, laboring on hands and knees, I spent the majority of my labor, which really, I mean, I had a really fast labor with my VBAC. It was only 4.5 hours, but I was on the toilet like for majority of that. Toilet's wonderful. Shower, tub, and if you do have an epidural, like get in a throne, you can get in hands and knees, you can get in an assisted squat. So just being as upright as possible on a birth ball, to really get baby in like an optimal position, and you in an optimal position for the best like engagement and descension into the birth canal. And then if you do have an epidural and you do like feel like laying on your back, that's fine. But it's not like the most optimal position for birthing and pushing. And especially for people who like struggled with pushing the first time, or their baby was in a weird position the first time, being upright can really help with that.
Okay. So, as a doula and speaking to other doulas, in the case of supporting a woman going through a VBAC or wanting to go through VBAC, how would you suggest we coach them through the mental and emotional stuff on the beginning or before the labor and then throughout the labor? How should we support them physically as well?
Yeah, so the biggest thing, and I know every doula is different on how they practice and how they run their prenatals, but education, healing, and mindset is like the biggest thing you can do, and it should be started like sooner than later. So I think the most work with VBAC clients comes like not even during the birth process, like before that. So just understanding their previous birth is a big one. If they are comfortable sharing that with you, hopefully they are. Understanding what happened. So like during the birth process, like where you're going to need to support them the most probably. So like my doula knew like during pushing, she had to be like on her A game because pushing was where I was like, I'm not pushing for 4 hours again. Screw that. So she knew like because of our work during the prenatals that like pushing was going to be a struggle for me. So like knowing where in the birth process they're going to need the most support, but also like the majority of like clients are doing all the research, are like educating themselves, but they need educational resources for their support people too, like their partner, their family members who have no idea what it all is. So I'm providing education and resources to them as well, because again, you never know how things are going to go. Like you don't know if labor is going to be so fast you're not going to be able to be there. So like having them prepared and ready to support, like there could be secondary birth trauma with their partner from the first birth that they need to work through. So it's not just about like your client directly, it's about everyone who's surrounding them as well, with that emotional prep and educational prep. And then physically, like the biggest thing is like going to be like giving them resources for physical preparation. Like if they have pains, if they need a pelvic floor PT recommendation, if they need a chiropractor recommendation. And then during the birth process, obviously like comfort measures, depending on their scenario, just like you would support that just as you would any other birth. But the mental part during the birth is going to be the biggest struggle. And I feel like that's the biggest struggle for everyone. But for VBAC especially, because like depending on their provider, they could not be supportive. It could be like a really just hostile birth environment. It could just be a negative birth environment. So just reminding them of their why and like knowing how they, like everyone's so different on how they want to be supported. Like some people want you to talk to them. Some people don't want you to talk to them at all. Some people want to be touched. Some people don't want to be touched. But mentally knowing like where their like hard triggers are going to be coming up, for them. And then like in the case of an emergency, in the case of a pivot, like what do they want your role to be in that, is a big one. So like, obviously none of us plan to have an emergency happen. None of us plan to have like a uterine rupture happen. But like in the event of that happening, they need to acknowledge that yes, this is a possibility. So in the case of this happening, like what do I need from you as my doula? What do I need from you like mentally? What do I need from you physically? Just having them like prepared for like those pivots and those changes of situations. If even if it's not a rupture, but if they end up with like needing a repeat C-section for whatever reason, how do they want that to look for you? Talking to their provider ahead of time in the hospital ahead of time could really be helpful for having the doula in the OR in the event that something does happen. Obviously not if it's like a crash stat C-section where like they have to be put under, you can't be back there. But just like having those plans ahead of time for like all scenarios, so you know what the heck you're doing as a doula, if something does happen, like what they want from you. And obviously like once you're in the moment, like if something does happen, they could be reacting way differently than how you planned, but at least having those plans in place of like what they would want your role to be in those situations.
Okay, on that same doula track, but flipping it around, what questions would you suggest a VBAC hopeful mom ask doulas while interviewing?
Yeah, so the biggest ones are going to be about like depending on where they're giving birth. So Some, it doesn't even necessarily matter if the doula has supported a VBAC before, but are they educated on it? First of all, like, do they know what the heck it is? Do they know the risks and benefits? Because they need to be able to like help provide that education, because the providers aren't providing it all. And I'm not saying everyone has to be the most educated on VBAC, but at least know the resources to give someone. But also, like, because every doula is different. So not all doulas support home birth, not all doulas support hospital birth. So obviously knowing, like, are you going to be okay with where I'm giving birth? First of all, do you feel confident supporting a birth here? Because there's already so much anxiety around VBAC in general. Like, if you don't, you want to make sure the doula is going to be comfortable supporting you in your birth place. Some doulas are like, oh, I'll support hospital births, but they're not really my favorite. You don't want to have like that negative energy if they're not going to be supportive, or if they don't feel comfortable supporting home births, then like opposite, ask them that. But ask them, like, if they supported VBAC before, obviously you can ask them that. But just because someone has supported 100 VBACs doesn't mean they're going to be the best support for you for a VBAC. But ask them, like, same as a provider, like, how do you feel about supporting VBAC clients? Have you ever supported them? What was your last experience like? Because just like providers, doulas have biases too, especially if maybe they personally had a C-section or a VBAC, and maybe they have biases around those things, and they're expecting your birth to be like their birth. So just asking those open-ended questions, just like you would a provider, but obviously it's going to be a little bit different. Like, a doula is not a medical provider. But like, how do you support about me choosing to electively induce for my VBAC? Like, some people might want to do that. How do you feel about me, like, if I choose to end up going, like, I want to be back now, but there is a potential that I may switch to a repeat C-section. Are you okay with that? Just like those types of questions to make sure they're really going to support you, because I know some doulas who, it's like VBAC or nothing. And if someone elects for a repeat C-section, they like feel super negatively about it. Or the doulas feel tied to the outcome of the birth. So if their VBAC client really, really wants a VBAC, but it ends in a repeat C-section, they feel like responsible for that. You are not responsible for that as a doula whatsoever. So,
okay. So for the mom listening who wants a VBAC but is nervous or doubting herself, what would you say to her?
the first thing I would say is, if, like, why, well, first of all, why are they nervous? It could be a lot of reasons. But if she's doubting herself, I would, like, the first thing is, like, why do you want to be back? That's a big reason, because someone could just say, like, I just don't want surgery again, or like, I had a really bad C-section experience, but really get down to that core deep why. Like, ask yourself the toddler questions is what I call them. So like, keep asking yourself why is that important to you? So really figuring out your core why is the biggest one. That's going to be like a motivator. But then ask yourself, like, if nobody else had an opinion, like if I heard no one else's opinions, no one else's like statistics, no one else's biases, like, what would my gut instinct be? Because we all hear, like, especially with social media, it's like exhausting. You hear everything. You hear like all the sides, which is good. Like, it's good to hear everything to an extent. But just to remember that, like, you are in control of your decisions. You are in control of like what you're wanting to do for this birth. And if you truly, truly want this feedback, okay, then figure out what you need to do to like put yourself in the best case scenario for that. And figure out why you're nervous. Like, what are your fears? Do some fear releasing. Because some people are just like, I'm scared. Well, what are you scared of? I don't know. I'm just scared. There has to be like something specifically that you're scared of and fearful of, and work through those fears and work on fear releasing. And not saying that like fear is never okay. Like, you can work through fears, but still be fearful in ways, or nervous or anxious. It's not like that has to go away. You can feel all the feelings. But just understand why you're choosing what you're choosing, what you want from your birth, and the support that you need. It's not going to be like an easy road. Like, it's going to be work to set yourself up for the best case scenario. And just knowing that, like, at the end of the day, how you can be at peace with either birth outcome is a big one. Knowing that even if you don't get your VBAC, even if you have a repeat C-section, knowing what you need to do for yourself mentally and physically to be able to be at peace with that, if that pivot has to be made.
That's great.
So you're obviously very passionate about VBACs. You've created an entire business on that base. What is something you wish more people knew about VBACs, and don't be afraid to get heated?
Okay. So, the first thing is like, I wish people understood and knew that it's not like this super risky, selfish, like out there decision. It's supported by ACOG in the majority of circumstances. I've talked to so many people that are like, why would you risk your and your baby's life just to get the birth experience you want? I'm like, if it was really that dangerous and really that risky and really like putting my baby's life at stake that much, ACOG would not support it as a good option for the majority of people who have C-sections. And I mean, that's also a loaded statement too, because ACOG supports a lot of things that are potentially like risky, but whatever. But just like knowing that it's a reasonable and safe option for the majority of people, and that you are not selfish for wanting a VBAC. You're not putting yourself above your baby for choosing to have a VBAC. Another thing is that, and this is more in relation to C-sections, but people choosing repeat C-sections thinking that they're like going to be risk-free. And I don't think people think there's no risks involved, but they think like, oh, that must be the safer decision. When really they were never counseled on the risks of repeat C-sections and multiple repeat C-sections at that. I've talked to women they're going in for their 6th or 7th C-section and they're literally scared of dying on the table. So it's like, yes, there's people that fear uterine rupture, but there's also people that fear the repeat C-section risks as well. So just knowing that it's a valid option and repeat C-section is not like a risk-free option, and that understanding the risk. I think a lot of people don't understand uterine rupture. Like, I truly don't think they do. And like, why would they? Why would they need to understand it? Especially like generationally, like everyone like in older generations are like, oh, you had a C-section, you're just going to have another one, right? They're like shocked and appalled when I tell them I had a VBAC. Like my grandma was like, what in the world are you doing? It's just like a generational thing. So I think people are becoming more educated about it. But uterine rupture specifically, it's like people truly believe that if you have a VBAC, you will rupture and you will die. It's like, please get educated on it before you have this fear surrounding it. And it's partly because like so many providers like put it like that. And then on social media, especially, like you only hear the negative things. Like you only ever hear about like all the catastrophic ruptures, right? You never hear about like all the VBACs that like, and people will say like, oh, well, that's like survivor's bias. Like you didn't rupture, your baby didn't die. Like, but it happened to me. I'm like, well, yeah, someone has to become a statistic. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be talked about. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be shared. But I think people just need to really understand more about uterine rupture. And another big thing is like with uterine rupture in general, like providers who act like they're so scared of uterine rupture, but then they like require induction for their VBACs. And I'm like, you're literally increasing the chance of uterine rupture by requiring induction for your VBAC. So you're not really scared of uterine rupture. Like that's not what you're fearful of. You're scared to get sued and like have legalities and all this crazy stuff. But like just understanding uterine rupture. And then another big one that I really wish more people understood is like, yes, like it's harder, I'm not saying harder, but it's harder to find support for VBACs in a hospital. And I feel like some women, not all, some choose their birth location, maybe more fearful of the hospital than like truly feeling like they're going to be safe where they're birthing. So home birth is not for everybody. like in hospital birth is not for everyone. Like not every birth location is going to be the same. Um, and I know not normally most people who choose home birth like choose it like in an educated way and like know what they're doing and know why they're choosing it. Um, but I know people who have had like bad VBAC experiences in the hospital and at home as far as uterine rupture goes. So just knowing that like that risk is there no matter what, and you should be choosing where you birth, like where you feel safest and most supported. So a lot of people who like VBAC at home and have HBAC get like so much heat and like so much like disgust from people. And like that's where they feel safest and most supported. And like they understand their risk for uterine rupture, no matter where they're birthing. And the majority of people like who have a rupture at home may not feel open talking about it. They may not feel comfortable talking about it because they may feel like they may regret their decision. They may not regret their decision. But like I've been in a couple different groups, Facebook groups and stuff where like a lot of people who do have like situations happen, whether at home or hospital, like generally leave those groups and like don't share their like catastrophic, like traumatic story. So we're not always seeing those things. But just knowing that like where people are choosing to birth is where they feel safest and most supported, and that's what matters. But also make sure you are choosing to birth where you feel safest and most supported, and not just because you feel like it's your only option. Sometimes it is your only option. Like some people have to birth in a hospital, and like even if they don't want to be there. But I've like talked to some people who are like, well, maybe I should have like a home birth for my next one. I'm like, do you feel safe at home? Do you feel supported at home? And they're like, well, maybe they live in like an abusive home environment or something. I'm like, do you really feel safest there? But they're like desperate to get their experience that they want. And some people are like, well, no. I'm like, well, then don't birth there. Like birth where you feel safest and most supported, whether that be home, hospital, birth center, free birth, whatever. And I feel like there's a lot of stigma just around like HBAC in general, and people thinking that it's just like way too risky, but everyone's risk tolerance is different. And I feel like more people should be supported in their choice to birth at home, especially for VBAC. And more and more people who are having like VBAC after multiple C-sections are birthing at home because it's like less likely to find support in the hospital setting. So I feel like the majority of times I'm seeing like VBAC after 2 or 3 or plus C-sections being done at home because they're not finding support in the hospital. So just like as doulas too, understanding that, like understanding why people are choosing to birth where they're birthing, and really being supportive and encouraging of that, and like supporting them through that, because they're not just like making this decision willy-nilly. They're making like this decision from like an educated standpoint, and where they feel safest birthing. So wow. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, that was amazing. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I so appreciate it. It is time. We need to wrap up. So before we do, can you tell us a little bit more about your VBAC offerings? I know you have a couple incredible programs for parents and birth professionals.
Yeah, so I have a VBAC prep program for parents called VBAC is Your Birthright. That is like a self-paced preparation program, focuses a lot on mental preparation and mental healing, but also includes that physical stuff as well. And then I have a training program for doulas called VBAC and cesarean for birth professionals. It is approved for 8 contact hours, and it covers like supporting VBAC and cesarean clients. I want to like highlight that because so many VBAC programs don't cover cesarean, they only cover VBAC. So it does cover both. And both of those can be found on my website, thehannahgill.com.
Amazing. And you have a podcast, right?
Yes, it's called Motherhood Flow, and it is on all podcast platforms.
Great. And then where's the best place for people to connect with you online?
So on Instagram at thehannahgill.
So I will have all of those linked in the show notes for anyone interested in looking into it. I'm currently in the VBAC and cesarean for birth professionals program, and I am loving it. It is so informational, and I'm so excited. But yeah, is there anything else you'd like to say before we go?
I don't think so. I just think like, just for everyone out there, just like know that VBAC is an option for you if you want it. And it's a well supported option. for if that's something that you want to do. So if you want to VBAC, just prepare for that and work for it and work your ass off for it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for joining me. This was a huge honor, and I'm so excited for all of the potential VBAC moms that are listening to really be informed and encouraged by what you have to say. And like I said, all of the resources that were talked about today are going to be in the show notes. And that's it. Thank you for joining us on Let's Talk Birth.